This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of pain that does not look like pain. It does not throw dishes. It does not slam doors. It does not leave bruises anyone can point to. It does not even always arrive with a clear ending. Sometimes it enters the room dressed as confusion. Sometimes it sounds like a slower reply, a colder tone, a glance that no longer lingers, a tenderness that used to come easily and now feels rationed. Sometimes it is just one sentence, said casually, that splits something open in me so quietly no one else notices the wound until I have been bleeding from it for weeks. That is the pain I want to talk about. The kind that makes me look normal from the outside while something inside me is collapsing in absolute silence. If this speaks to something you have lived, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. It helps this space keep growing, and it gives me the chance to keep making these kinds of honest conversations for women who do not need more noise, but something true. When a man hurts me, the first instinct is rarely to leave. That is the part people do not say enough. The first instinct is not always anger. Not always distance. Not even self-protection. Very often, the first instinct is to be understood. I want him to see it. I want him to feel the exact weight of what he has done. I want him to understand why my chest went tight in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Why I stood in my kitchen in Charleston staring at a glass of water I forgot to drink. Why I drove home with the radio off because even music felt like too much company for the thoughts I was trying to outrun. Why I kept replaying the same conversation as if there were a hidden sentence inside it that could explain everything and save me from having to feel this much. That is the instinct that arrives first. Not revenge. Recognition. Because being hurt by a man is one thing. But being hurt and then left alone with the meaning of it is something else entirely. It creates a very specific kind of torment. Not just the wound itself, but the unbearable need to make the wound legible. I want to hold it up in the light and say, look. This is what happened here. This is what your silence did. This is what your inconsistency did. This is what your half-love, your hesitation, your distance, your carefully timed affection did to a woman who kept trying to meet you with honesty. And beneath all of that, if I am completely honest, there is another confession, quieter and harder to admit. I want the hurt to matter because I want to matter. That is why the beginning feels so dangerous. Because in the first hours, or days, or sometimes weeks after a man hurts me, I can mistake my longing to be understood for love, for dignity, for closure, for strength. I tell myself I am only trying to be clear, only trying to communicate, only trying to make sure I do not leave anything unsaid. But often what I am really doing is standing at the edge of my own wound, asking the person who made it to confirm that it is real. That is where power begins to leak. Not dramatically, quietly. In the drafted messages I never send. In the ones I do. In the way I keep checking the phone even when I tell myself I am done. In the way my day starts to reorganize itself around whether Daniel has reached out, softened, explained, returned, regretted. There is something almost unbearable about that stage because I can feel two truths at once. One part of me knows better. Another part of me still aches like a child locked outside in the cold. I know what women like me look like from the outside. We are capable. We are composed. We get things done. We show up for work. We answer emails. We make dinner. We smile at neighbors. We remember birthdays. We carry the invisible architecture of our lives without asking for applause. By all visible standards, we are fine. And yet one man's withdrawal can make the whole inner world go dark. That is not weakness. That is what happens when pain does not arrive alone. It lands on top of every old moment I swallowed instead of naming. Every time I told myself not to be dramatic. Every time I translated disappointment into patience. Every time I confused endurance with maturity. Every time I stayed calm so no one would call me difficult while something inside me was quietly begging not to be left there again. So when Daniel hurts me, the ache is rarely just about him. It is about the accumulation. The old loneliness. The old waiting. The old shape of trying to remain gracious while being slowly erased. And because the pain is layered, the instinct to be understood becomes almost feral in its intensity. I do not only want him to understand this moment. I want him to understand every moment I never had language for. I want him to understand the cost of what women carry silently. I want him to understand what it does to a woman to keep loving through ambiguity until ambiguity becomes the atmosphere she breathes. But here is the beginning of the truth, and it is a hard one. He may never understand. He may never fully see what his behavior touched in me. He may never grasp the depth of the damage because some people move through the world protected by their own emotional limits. They feel only the part of the story that inconveniences them. They hear only the version that does not require transformation. They apologize just enough to quiet the room, not enough to tell the truth. And if I keep waiting for full recognition from someone emotionally unequipped to offer it, I will stay trapped in the first chamber of pain. That chamber is full of questions. Why did he do this? Why was I not enough? Was any of it real? What did I miss? What should I have said sooner, better, differently? But beneath those questions, in a much quieter place, another question waits. It does not shout. It barely speaks above a whisper. But once I hear it, everything begins to change. What is this pain asking me to notice? That question does not flatter me. It does not give me the clean satisfaction of blame. It does not let me stay the heroine of a simple story. But it does return me to myself. Because pain, before it becomes identity, is information. It shows me where I abandoned myself to preserve connection. It shows me where I accepted confusion because certainty felt too lonely. It shows me where I kept shrinking my truth into something easier to digest. It shows me how often I made him the center of a conversation my own soul had been trying to have with me for years. That is why this opening matters so much. Because the first wound is not always what he did. Sometimes the first wound is how quickly I leave myself in order to be understood by him. And maybe that is the real mystery at the heart of heartbreak. Not why he changed. Not why he pulled away. Not why he could touch something sacred and still treat it casually. But why I was taught, in ways both visible and invisible, to believe that my pain needed his recognition before it could become real. This is where the story begins. Not with his apology. Not with his return. Not with justice. With the moment I begin to suspect that the answer I am chasing from him may actually be the doorway back to me. Why reaction gives away power. What took me longer to understand was this: the moment I react from pain, I often hand over the very thing I am trying to protect. Not my love. Not my pride. My center. There is a strange urgency that rises in me after I have been hurt by Daniel. It does not feel like weakness when it arrives. It feels like necessity. It feels intelligent, justified, almost noble. I tell myself I need to answer now because silence will distort the truth. I tell myself I need to explain now because if I wait, the moment will harden into misunderstanding. I tell myself I need to speak before my dignity disappears beneath his version of events. But pain is persuasive. That is what makes reaction so dangerous. It rarely introduces itself as panic. It enters wearing the clothes of clarity. It says, send the message. Correct the story. Tell him exactly what he did. Do not let him walk away comfortable. Do not let him think this did not matter. Do not let him leave you carrying all of it alone. And because the hurt is real, the urgency feels real too. I have sat at my kitchen table in Charleston with that feeling moving through me like a current. My phone in front of me. My pulse sharp. My mind writing entire conversations faster than I could contain them. The text I want to send always sounds so clean in my head at first. Honest. Measured. Final. I imagine that if I can say it in the right order, with the right restraint, with just enough feeling but not too much, something will shift. He will finally understand the cost of his distance. He will hear the truth in a way he could not ignore. He will be faced, at last, with the reality of what he has done. But by the time a woman is sitting in that kind of urgency, she is often no longer speaking from power. She is speaking from injury. And injury has its own logic. It is not stupid. It is wounded. It wants relief more than wisdom. It wants movement more than truth. It would rather do something painful than sit still inside uncertainty for one more hour. That is why reaction can feel so irresistible. It offers temporary escape from helplessness. The moment I send the message, make the call, press the point, I no longer have to sit in the suspended ache of not knowing. I have acted. I have moved. I have declared myself. For a brief moment, that can feel like strength. But action and power are not always the same thing. Sometimes reaction is just pain looking for somewhere to go. And when I pour that pain directly into Daniel's hands, I make him the immediate keeper of my emotional weather. I tell myself I am reclaiming the truth, but very often I am doing something else entirely. I am tying my nervous system to his next move. Now I wait. For his tone. For his timing. For whether he answers at all. For whether he answers kindly. For whether he dodges. For whether he apologizes. For whether he turns my vulnerability into something I have to defend. That is the theft hidden inside reaction. It does not only expose my pain. It often transfers my stability into someone else's custody. And that is too expensive. I do not say this because silence is always superior. Some things must be said. Some moments require language. Some endings deserve clean truth. But there is a profound difference between speaking from grounded clarity and reacting because my body cannot tolerate the discomfort of being unseen for one more minute. I know that difference now because I have lived both. I know what it is to send the long message and feel emptier afterward. I know what it is to try to be exact, thoughtful, fair, and then realize that no arrangement of words can create depth in a person who is committed to staying emotionally shallow. I know what it is to explain my hurt with such precision that I almost convince myself the conversation is meaningful, when in reality I am simply bleeding incomplete sentences. That kind of reaction leaves a residue. Not just shame, although sometimes there is shame. A more private sorrow. The sorrow of realizing I have offered my rawest self in a place that has not earned access to it. There is something especially painful about this in midlife. By now, I know language. I know nuance. I know how to speak without screaming. I know how to tell the truth without making a scene. And because I can do that, I can be tempted to believe that my reaction is not really reaction at all. I can call it communication. I can call it closure. I can call it being direct. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it is simply a polished form of panic. That is the hard truth. Not all eloquence is wisdom. Sometimes it is just desperation with good grammar. Daniel always seemed more comfortable when I was reacting than when I was still. He may not have known that consciously, but I could feel it. A reactive woman is easier to place. Easier to answer. Easier to delay. Easier to study from a distance. Her pain is visible. Her need is legible. The script is familiar. He knows the role he gets to play when I become urgent. He can become patient, detached, confused, superior, defensive, evasive, wounded himself. But he still gets to remain inside the structure of the exchange. Stillness threatens that structure. Because stillness does not give him immediate access to my wound. Stillness does not rush to clarify what he should already have had the character to notice. Stillness does not perform pain in a way that allows him to remain the center of the event. That is why reaction gives away power. Not because emotion is weak. Not because anger is ugly. Not because pain should be hidden. But because when I react on impulse, I let the injury choose the form of my response. I let the most destabilized part of me speak first. I hand over the microphone before the wiser part of me has entered the room. And the wiser part of me is slower. She does not deny what happened. She does not minimize the wound. She does not call coldness complexity or confusion chemistry. But she knows that the first impulse to respond is not always the truest one. She knows that urgency can be a trap. She knows that relief is not the same as resolution. She knows that if I speak too soon, I may only deepen my attachment to the very dynamic that is hurting me. That is why the pause matters. Not as performance. Not as a tactic. As protection. The pause lets me ask better questions. Not just, what do I want to say? But, what do I want this to do? Am I trying to honor myself, or am I trying to control how Daniel sees me? Am I expressing truth, or am I bargaining for recognition? Am I speaking because the words are necessary, or because I cannot bear the humiliation of being misunderstood? Those questions are not always flattering. But they are freeing. Because once I begin asking them, I stop confusing expression with empowerment. I see more clearly that not every honest impulse needs to become immediate contact. Not every ache deserves an audience. Not every wound should be carried back to the person who caused it and laid at his feet like proof of devotion. Sometimes the most powerful thing I can do is keep the energy with me. Keep the message unsent for one night. Keep the grief in the room long enough for it to become intelligible. Keep my dignity from becoming another performance of pain for someone who has grown too comfortable watching me carry the emotional weight alone. That is not repression. It is containment. And containment is not cold. It is sacred. It is the ability to say, this is real, this hurts, this matters, and I will not let the first wave of pain dictate what happens next. I think that is where power begins to return. Not when I win the exchange. Not when I say the most devastating thing. Not when Daniel finally realizes what he has done. But when I stop handing my inner life over to the speed of my hurt. That is a different kind of strength. Quieter. Less theatrical. Harder to notice from the outside. But from the inside, it changes everything. Because the woman who no longer reacts on cue is no longer easy to organize around someone else's confusion. And that is the first moment she becomes difficult to control. The nervous system knows before the mind explains. Before my mind can build the argument, my body has already chosen a side. That is one of the most humbling truths I have learned. I used to think pain began in thought. I believed the suffering started when I replayed the conversation, when I interpreted Daniel's tone, when I tried to understand why a man could come so close and then move so far away without ever naming the distance. I thought if I could think more clearly, more maturely, more objectively, I could control the damage. I thought the mind was where heartbreak happened. It is not. Heartbreak happens in the body first. It happens in the half-second before thought has language. In the tightening across my chest when his message feels colder than it should. In the drop in my stomach when the silence stretches too long. In the strange heat that rises behind my face when something in his tone carries dismissal, even if the words themselves look harmless on the screen. In the way my shoulders lift without permission, as if some ancient part of me is preparing for impact before I have consciously admitted there is anything to fear. The body notices before the mind explains. That matters more than most people understand. Because if I ignore that truth, I will spend all my time trying to reason with pain that is not yet living in reason. I will keep speaking to myself as if I am a courtroom when I am, in fact, a nervous system. I will ask for logic from a body that has already moved into defense. I will tell myself I am overthinking when what I am really doing is bracing. And bracing is not the same as thinking. There were afternoons in Charleston when I would tell myself I was fine while my body quietly testified otherwise. I would answer emails, fold laundry, put groceries away, straighten the pillows on the sofa, move through the ordinary architecture of adult life with all the outward signs of composure. But by evening, my jaw would ache. My neck would be tight. I would realize I had not taken one full breath in hours. My appetite would vanish without drama. My skin would feel too thin. The body had already entered the event long before my mind was ready to say the sentence out loud. Something feels wrong here. That sentence can take the mind a very long time to speak. The body is often less sentimental. It does not care how articulate Daniel can be when he wants to be. It does not care how charming he sounds when he circles back. It does not care how reasonable I am trying to remain. The body reads rhythm, absence, inconsistency, emotional temperature. It registers what is present and what is missing. It notices when warmth becomes rationed. It notices when contact starts to feel like uncertainty instead of connection. It notices when I leave a conversation smaller than I entered it. The body is not interested in the story I want to tell. It is interested in survival. That may sound dramatic, but it is not. It is biological. When I feel relational instability, my system does not experience it as an abstract emotional concept. It experiences it as a threat to regulation, a threat to orientation, a threat to the felt sense that something is steady and safe. That is why heartbreak can seem disproportionate from the outside. The event may look small. A delayed reply, a shift in tone, a withdrawal with no real explanation. But the internal response can be enormous because the body is not measuring appearances. It is measuring danger. This is where I had to become much more honest with myself. I was not just reacting to Daniel in the present. My body was reacting to everything his behavior touched. Every old moment of uncertainty. Every earlier version of waiting. Every time I had to guess what was happening because no one would say it plainly. Every season in my life when emotional clarity was withheld and I was expected to remain gracious anyway. The body stores these things differently than the mind. The mind edits, reframes, rationalizes, makes meaning. The body remembers in sensation. Tight throat, heavy chest, restless sleep, sudden fatigue. That strange internal drop that arrives before tears, before anger, before language. I think many women are taught to mistrust that level of knowing. We are encouraged to be reasonable, to gather evidence, to avoid assumptions, to stay balanced, to not be too sensitive. So we override what the body tells us because it feels less respectable than analysis. We would rather appear wise than admit that our nervous system is exhausted. We would rather call ourselves thoughtful than acknowledge we are living in a state of quiet alarm. I did that for far too long. I tried to understand Daniel from the neck up while my body kept whispering the truth from below. Not in accusations. In sensations. In contraction. In the unmistakable fact that I did not feel spacious around him anymore. I did not feel rested after talking to him. I did not feel settled in the bond. I felt vigilant. And vigilance, no matter how elegantly disguised, is not peace. This is the danger of ignoring the nervous system. I start making emotional decisions based on intellect alone while the body continues sending signals that I call inconvenient. Then I wonder why I am so tired. Why I cannot relax. Why my mind will not let go. Why one man can occupy so much psychic space. It is because the body does not feel complete. It has not received the signal of safety. Safety is not the same as love. That is another truth I had to learn the hard way. I may love someone and still not feel safe in the rhythm of who they are. I may miss them and still feel my stomach tighten when their name appears on my phone. I may want the story to work and still feel my body go cold at the thought of stepping back into the same dynamic. These contradictions confused me once. Now they instruct me. Because the nervous system is often the first place clarity arrives. Not as a grand revelation. As a bodily fact. I relax when I stop reaching. I sleep better when I stop waiting. I breathe deeper when I stop hoping for a message. I feel more like myself when I am not arranging my inner life around Daniel's inconsistency. Those are not small details. They are evidence. The body is not dramatic. It is precise. If I sit by the window in the evening and place one hand on my chest, one on my stomach, and ask nothing of myself except honesty, the body will usually answer before the mind catches up. It answers in expansion or constriction, in softness or tension, in whether I feel more like I am returning to myself or disappearing from myself. That kind of knowledge is subtle. But once I begin respecting it, my whole relationship to pain changes. I stop asking only, what does this mean? I begin asking, what is this doing to me? That question is less glamorous and far more useful. Because heartbreak is not just a story I tell. It is a state my body lives in. And if I want to reclaim power, I cannot do it by arguing with sensation. I have to learn to witness it, to name it, to stay with it long enough for it to reveal its intelligence. Not rush past it. Not spiritualize it. Not shame it. Listen to it. Some evenings that listening looked very simple. Standing barefoot in my kitchen. Holding a warm mug with both hands. Looking out at the fading Charleston light and noticing that my shoulders had dropped for the first time all day. Other times it meant walking without music so I could hear my own breath. It meant not reaching for distraction the moment discomfort rose. It meant telling myself the truth in plain language. My body is not confused. My body is responding. That distinction gave me back a great deal of compassion for myself. I stopped framing my sensitivity as fragility. I stopped calling my activation irrational. I stopped making character judgments about survival responses. Instead, I began to see that the body was not betraying me. It was protecting me, even if imperfectly. It was trying to say what the mind was still too loyal, too hopeful, or too frightened to admit. And once I understood that, everything became more intimate. Healing was no longer about becoming less emotional. It was about becoming more honest with the place where emotion actually lives. It was about learning that wisdom does not begin when I explain my pain beautifully. It begins when I recognize that my body has been speaking all along. The nervous system knows before the mind explains. And if I am willing to listen, it will tell me not only where I am hurt, but where I am no longer meant to stay. Stillness is not weakness. It is emotional sovereignty. There is a kind of stillness that does not come from peace. It comes from fear. From old training. From the habit of swallowing what I feel so no one has to be inconvenienced by it. From becoming agreeable in the presence of what diminishes me. I know that stillness well. It is the stillness of a woman who has learned how to survive a room by leaving herself before anyone else can. But that is not the stillness I mean now. The stillness I mean is far more dangerous. It does not collapse. It does not beg. It does not rush to defend itself. It does not perform understanding while something sacred inside me is being mishandled. It is not numbness. It is not passivity. It is not the silence of a woman who has nothing left to say. It is the silence of a woman who no longer believes every wound deserves immediate access to her voice. That kind of stillness unsettled me before I ever learned to trust it. Because for much of my life, I had mistaken visible reaction for honesty. I believed that if I felt something deeply, I should name it quickly. If I was hurt, I should make the hurt known. If something was unfair, I should clarify the truth before it hardened into distortion. I did not think of this as drama. I thought of it as integrity. And sometimes it was. But not always. Sometimes what I called honesty was simply an inability to remain with myself long enough to know what the pain was actually asking of me. Sometimes what I called communication was really an urgent attempt to regulate the discomfort of being hurt and unseen at the same time. Sometimes what I called emotional maturity was just my old compulsion to do all the emotional labor before the other person had even shown the capacity to meet me there. That is where stillness began to change meaning for me. Not as a tactic. As a form of self-governance. When Daniel hurt me, my first temptation was almost never to disappear. It was to move toward the rupture. To explain. To bring language. To make sure he understood the texture of the wound. To articulate it clearly enough that no decent man could miss what had happened. I wanted to be fair, precise, thoughtful. I wanted to give him every chance to meet the truth. But emotional sovereignty begins the moment I stop treating my inner life like a document that requires his review. That is the shift. Subtle, but absolute. Because as long as I believe my pain must be delivered, translated, and confirmed in order to matter, I am still living inside someone else's field. Still measuring reality through their willingness to receive it. Still giving another person too much authority over the atmosphere inside me. Stillness breaks that arrangement. Stillness says, I can know what happened without turning it into a performance of proof. Stillness says, I do not need to make this immediately legible to the person who benefited from not seeing it sooner. Stillness says, my first responsibility is not to make my pain understandable. It is to remain in relationship with myself while I feel it. That is why stillness is so often misunderstood, especially in women. We are expected to be responsive, emotionally articulate, verbally available. We are often praised for our ability to process, explain, soothe, contextualize, and bring emotional order to what other people leave in fragments. We become the translators of tension, the managers of atmosphere, the ones who can hold complexity without flinching. And then one day, when that same capacity begins to cost too much, we discover something unsettling. People are often more comfortable with our reaction than with our restraint. A reactive woman can be studied, managed, delayed, reframed. Her emotion is visible. Her need is on the table. The dynamic remains active because she is still engaged in it. But a still woman, one who is no longer feeding the exchange with immediate emotional access, changes the structure entirely. She cannot be placed as easily. She cannot be soothed with the same crumbs. She cannot be pulled into the familiar choreography where he withholds and she reaches, he distances and she interprets, he wounds and she explains. Stillness interrupts the dance. That is why it feels so powerful from the inside and so confusing from the outside. I remember an evening in Charleston when Daniel said something in public that was not overtly cruel, which almost made it worse. It was one of those polished dismissals that pass easily between people who know how to hide harm inside tone. Nothing anyone else at the table could point to with certainty. Nothing dramatic enough to justify visible pain. Just enough to make me feel abruptly reduced in my own skin. The older version of me would have carried that moment like a live wire. I would have stored it for later, turned it over in my mind, prepared language for the ride home, felt the need to account for exactly why it hurt, why it mattered, why he could not keep doing this thing where my humanity became negotiable in subtle ways. But that night, something else happened. I felt the sting. I felt the immediate heat of humiliation. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the need to mark the injury before it spread. And then, just as clearly, I felt another presence beneath it. Slower. Less interested in being understood. More interested in not abandoning myself again. So I stayed quiet. Not the quiet of suppression. The quiet of refusal. I did not offer him my immediate wound. I did not convert my pain into conversation just because he had created it. I did not rescue the moment by becoming emotionally available to it. That kind of quiet changed me. Because for the first time, I saw that stillness was not the absence of response. It was a response shaped by dignity instead of urgency. That distinction matters. Suppression hides feeling because it is afraid of what feeling will expose. Stillness honors feeling without making it instantly public. Suppression disconnects me from myself. Stillness returns me to myself. Suppression says, "This does not matter enough to speak." Stillness says, "This matters too much to hand over carelessly." Once I understood that, I stopped treating silence as one thing. I began to feel its different textures. There is a silence that shrinks. And there is a silence that protects. There is a silence that comes from powerlessness. And there is a silence that comes from no longer consenting to a dynamic that feeds on my immediate reaction. The stillness I am speaking of is not performative indifference. I am not talking about pretending not to care. That kind of performance is brittle. It asks too much of the body. It creates distance where honesty is needed. No, the stillness I trust is deeply feeling. It knows exactly what is happening. It notices every contraction. It registers the insult, the dismissal, the absence, the emotional dodge. It simply chooses not to let the first wave of pain dictate the shape of the response. That is sovereignty. Not control over him. Governance over me. The ability to remain rooted in my own timing even when someone else is being careless with my heart. The ability to let a moment be incomplete. The ability to leave a silence unfilled. The ability to say, "I do not owe immediate emotional labor to every person who unsettles me." That last part changed everything. Because I had spent years confusing immediacy with sincerity. I thought a delayed response meant I was being avoidant. I thought not speaking right away meant I was betraying my truth. I thought pausing meant losing ground. But pausing gave me ground. It gave me room to ask better questions. What would speaking now actually serve? Would these words protect my dignity or expose my desperation? Am I trying to tell the truth, or am I trying to force recognition from someone who has not earned that level of access to me? Would this conversation move me closer to peace, or just bind me tighter to the same cycle? Stillness gave me enough distance to tell the difference. And that distance was not cold. It was merciful. It stopped me from making my most destabilized self the spokesperson for my deepest values. It stopped me from handing Daniel the raw interior of my pain before I had even held it myself. It stopped me from reenacting the same old pattern in which I become eloquent at the exact moment I most need containment. I think this is why a still woman can seem so powerful. Not because she has mastered emotion. Because she is no longer ruled by the fear of not being understood immediately. She can bear the discomfort of leaving the moment unresolved. She can let truth ripen before she speaks it. She can endure the space between feeling and action without rushing to fill it with explanation. That kind of capacity changes the entire emotional field. A man like Daniel may call it distance. He may call it change. He may even call it confusing. But what he is often encountering is something much more precise. He is encountering a woman whose inner life is no longer available on impulse. A woman who can feel deeply without leaking. A woman who does not need to become louder in order to remain true. A woman who has learned that dignity is not in never being hurt. It is in what I refuse to do with my hurt once it arrives. Stillness, then, is not a retreat from truth. It is truth, protected from haste. It is grief without performance. Clarity without noise. Self-respect without spectacle. And for a woman who has spent years translating herself for others, there is almost nothing more sovereign than that. Stop explaining, let energy speak. There is a point in some relationships when explanation stops being an act of honesty and starts becoming a form of self-erasure. That realization did not come to me all at once. It came slowly, with the exhaustion of repetition. The same truth spoken in different language. The same wound offered in softer terms. The same need translated into something more reasonable, more graceful, more digestible, as if my pain might finally become acceptable if I presented it without edges. I had spent so much time trying to explain myself to Daniel that I almost failed to notice what the explaining itself was doing to me. It was thinning me out. Not because words are weak. Words matter. Clarity matters. Language can be sacred when it comes from a place of inner steadiness. But there is a kind of over-explaining that has very little to do with truth and everything to do with fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of seeming difficult. Fear of being left holding a reality the other person refuses to name. Fear that if I do not keep clarifying myself, I will disappear inside his version of events. That is the deeper wound beneath so much explaining. I am not always trying to communicate. Sometimes I am trying not to vanish. And that is a painful thing to admit, especially for a woman who prides herself on being thoughtful, articulate, fair. It is easy to romanticize my own patience. Easy to call it maturity. Easy to believe that my willingness to keep naming what hurts is evidence of emotional depth. But eventually I had to face something far less flattering and far more honest. I was explaining because I still hoped language could do what character had not. I hoped the right sentence would produce integrity in him. I hoped the right tone would awaken care. I hoped the right amount of restraint would make my reality undeniable. But some people do not fail to understand because the words are unclear. They fail to understand because understanding would require a version of themselves they have not chosen to become. That truth changed me. Because once I saw it clearly, I could no longer keep pouring my spirit into explanations designed to make Daniel emotionally accessible to himself. I could no longer keep acting as if my job was to build a bridge to a place he had shown very little intention of walking toward. There is a quiet humiliation in explaining too much. Not because needing to be heard is shameful. It is not. The humiliation comes from realizing I have been offering increasing levels of emotional clarity to someone who benefits from ambiguity. I have been making my inner life more visible while he remains comfortably obscured. I have been showing him where I bleed while he stays vague enough to avoid the moral pressure of seeing the blood on his hands. That imbalance is corrosive. It teaches me to work harder every time I am hurt. To become softer every time he becomes less accountable. To become clearer every time he becomes more evasive. And somewhere inside that pattern, I begin to confuse my labor with love. That is when explanation becomes dangerous. Because it starts to look virtuous while quietly training me to betray my own limits. I think many women know this pattern intimately. We do not always raise our voices. We do not always create scenes. More often, we become even more composed. We choose our words carefully. We explain from a place that appears measured and adult. We say, I just want to be honest. We say, I'm only trying to make sure we understand each other. We say, I don't want there to be confusion. But underneath that composure, the body is paying a price. The chest tightens. The appetite fades. The mind keeps revising. The night stretches. And all the while, some deeper part of me knows I am spending too much life trying to make someone else rise to the level of truth I already had to drag myself to just to survive the interaction. That is when energy becomes more honest than language. Because energy does not argue. It does not justify. It does not need to build a convincing case. It simply changes. I answer less quickly. I stop offering the same softness to the same carelessness. I do not pick up the phone just because he has reached for me at the hour most convenient for his loneliness. I do not explain why I need distance from what has repeatedly unsettled me. I do not volunteer context for boundaries that only became necessary because my earlier openness was mishandled. This kind of shift can look harsh from the outside, especially if a woman has spent years being available. But from the inside, it often feels less like harshness and more like alignment. A long-delayed ending to the habit of making myself accessible beyond what is healthy simply because someone expects access. I remember the first time I let that shift happen without dressing it up in language. Daniel reached out late one evening, the familiar pattern in his tone. Not cruel. Not urgent. Just close enough to suggest a return, vague enough to keep responsibility at a distance. The old version of me would have read every layer of it. I would have asked what he meant. I would have searched for tenderness. I would have felt compelled to answer because silence would have seemed too sharp, too final, too unlike the woman I had always been with him. But something in me had changed by then. I saw the message. I felt the old reflex. And then I let the phone remain where it was. No paragraph. No elegant statement of boundaries. No explanation about my exhaustion, my healing, my need for consistency, my desire for peace. Just stillness in action. That moment taught me more than many conversations ever had. Because I realized how deeply I had associated my goodness with my availability. I had believed that being loving meant remaining reachable. That being emotionally mature meant always offering context, always softening the edge, always making my needs understandable enough that no one could call me unfair. But self-respect does not always come wrapped in explanation. Sometimes it comes as a closed door with no speech attached. Sometimes it comes as a delayed reply. Sometimes it comes as a sentence I do not send. Sometimes it comes as silence, not because I have nothing to say, but because I have finally learned that not every truth needs to be hand-delivered to the person who kept refusing to hold it. There is something deeply feminine and deeply wounded in the instinct to explain ourselves into safety. To make our boundaries beautiful enough, compassionate enough, articulate enough that the other person will receive them without resistance. We want our withdrawal to be understood. We want our no to be respected. We want even our self-protection to be seen as reasonable. But real boundaries do not require permission. They do not become valid because the other person agrees with them. And they do not owe emotional comfort to the person who made them necessary. That was one of the hardest things for me to learn. Because I wanted Daniel to understand my changed energy. I wanted him to see that I was not punishing him, not being childish, not playing games. I wanted him to know that I was simply tired of feeling small inside a connection that could not hold me cleanly. But eventually I saw that even this desire to be understood was another extension of the same pattern. Another attempt to control how I would be perceived. Another way of keeping myself emotionally tethered to his interpretation. And there is no freedom there. Freedom begins when my energy no longer depends on whether he calls it fair. It begins when my peace is allowed to exist without a closing argument. Energy speaks in a language many people understand only after words have failed. It says, Access has changed. The rhythm is different now. The door is no longer open in the way it used to be. You do not get the same version of me after treating me as though my presence were an endless resource. That message does not need embellishment. In fact, language can weaken it when language is used to seek approval for the shift. There is power in becoming less available without becoming cruel. There is power in no longer making your tenderness instantly reachable. There is power in understanding that constant access is not the same as intimacy, and that many women have mistaken responsiveness for closeness simply because they were taught that love should look like emotional generosity without end. But generosity without discernment becomes depletion. And depletion, if left unnamed, begins to feel like identity. I did not want that for myself anymore. I did not want to be the woman who could describe every wound beautifully and still keep opening the same door. I did not want to be the woman who was endlessly understandable and increasingly erased. I did not want my love to be measured by how much I could absorb without changing shape. So I began letting energy tell the truth my words had been trying too hard to carry. I stopped making immediate emotional access part of my character. I stopped explaining what should have been obvious to a man willing to pay attention. I stopped believing that the burden was on me to make self-respect look gentle enough for him to accept. That shift was not dramatic. It was almost invisible. And yet it changed everything. Because the moment I stopped explaining every boundary, every retreat, every change in tone, I was no longer asking Daniel to co-sign my reality. I was simply living it. That is a different order of power. Quieter. Cleaner. Harder to manipulate. It does not prove itself. It does not plead to be understood. It just changes the atmosphere. And sometimes that is the clearest truth a woman can offer. Withdrawal is not a game, it is a return to myself. The hardest part of stepping back was not losing Daniel. It was facing the silence that appeared when I stopped chasing what had been keeping me occupied. That silence was not empty the way I thought it would be. It was crowded. It held old instincts, old fears, old habits of reaching. It held the part of me that had become so accustomed to emotional motion that stillness felt unnatural. It held the restless need to check, to wonder, to interpret, to keep one hand psychologically extended toward him even after I had begun to understand that the connection itself was costing me too much. That is why withdrawal is so often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look strategic, cold, deliberate in the wrong way. People assume a woman pulls back because she wants to be chaste, because she wants to teach a lesson, because she wants to make a man feel the loss of her attention. And yes, some people do use distance that way. But that was not the kind of withdrawal I was learning. The withdrawal I am talking about begins much deeper than behavior. It begins in the soul, in the moment I realize I have been living too far away from myself. That realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. In how tired I was after every interaction with Daniel. In how quickly my mood could shift because of one message, one delay, one subtle temperature change in his voice. In how much of my inner life had become organized around anticipation. Not joy. Not creation. Not presence. Anticipation. That is one of the quietest forms of self-loss. Nothing dramatic has to happen. No public collapse. No obvious betrayal. A woman can lose herself simply by becoming too devoted to the emotional weather of someone else. By tracking him too closely. By staying psychically near him long after the relationship has stopped feeling clean. By giving so much attention to his rhythm that she can no longer hear her own. That was the threshold I had crossed without meaning to. I had not disappeared in some cinematic way. I was still functioning. Still handling my life in Charleston. Still buying groceries, answering emails, making appointments, showing up for the practical requirements of adulthood. But something quieter had happened underneath all that competence. My attention no longer belonged fully to me. A portion of it was always left on the table between Daniel and me, waiting to see whether warmth would return, whether clarity would come, whether this latest silence meant something final or just another cycle I would once again have to survive with grace. When I finally began to withdraw, what I was really doing was collecting that scattered attention and calling it home. That is why it felt so difficult at first. Because reaching had become a reflex. Not always outwardly. Sometimes I did not send the message or make the call. But inwardly, I was still reaching. Still rehearsing. Still imagining what I would say if he wrote. Still leaving emotional space for him inside my evenings, my walks, my kitchen, my sleep. There is a form of attachment that continues even in silence. Withdrawal breaks that attachment at the level of energy before it ever becomes visible in action. It asks something harder than leaving. It asks me to stop orienting myself around someone who cannot hold me with steadiness. That kind of stopping can feel brutal. Not because it is wrong, but because it exposes the extent of the dependence I had hidden beneath dignity. I did not depend on Daniel materially. I did not need him to run my life. But emotionally, I had allowed too much of my internal climate to become vulnerable to his inconsistency. And when I began to pull back, I could feel the withdrawal almost like a physical ache. The body wanting the familiar rhythm, even when the familiar rhythm was painful. The mind wanting one more answer, even when answers had rarely brought peace. This is where many women return to the cycle. Not because they are weak. Because withdrawal reveals the rawness underneath the pattern. It strips away the noise. It removes the constant stimulation of waiting, interpreting, hoping, reacting. And what remains is often grief. Not only grief for the relationship. Grief for how long I abandoned myself inside it. That was the grief I had to face. The grief of realizing how much energy I had poured into emotional management. How often I had tried to make the space between us livable by filling it with my own patience, my own language, my own softness, my own tolerance for uncertainty. The grief of seeing that I had made a private religion out of enduring ambiguity with dignity. The grief of understanding that I had called this love when, many times, it was simply me trying to survive the absence of what I really needed. Withdrawal gave me no place to hide from that truth. And yet that is exactly what made it sacred. Because once the noise faded, I could finally hear myself again. Not my fear. Not my fantasy. Myself. I heard it in small things first. In the strange relief that arrived when I stopped checking my phone before bed. In how different my evenings felt when I did not leave them half open for Daniel's possible return. In the way Charleston itself began to reappear to me when my mind was no longer so crowded. The late light on the houses. The salt in the air near the water. The simple dignity of walking without emotional urgency. None of those things were new. I was. Or rather, I was becoming available to my own life again. That is the return people miss when they talk about withdrawal as if it is only about the other person. It is not primarily about creating distance from him. It is about creating proximity to me. That is a very different thing. It means I begin to ask other questions. Not whether he misses me. Whether I miss myself. Not whether he feels the absence. Whether I can feel my own presence. Not whether the silence is working on him. Whether the silence is working on me. And slowly, if I stay with it long enough, it does. Something starts to settle. The mind loses its frantic edge. The body unclenches in places I did not realize had been tense for months. Ordinary life regains texture. I stop living as if every day is merely the hallway between one emotional event and the next. That may sound small to someone who has never lived in anticipatory heartbreak, but it is not small. It is liberation in its earliest form. Withdrawal also taught me something painful but necessary. There is a difference between loneliness and misalignment. For a long time, I confused the two. I thought if I felt lonely without Daniel, that meant the connection was meaningful enough to keep trying. But loneliness is not always a sign to return. Sometimes it is just the nervous system mourning the loss of a familiar pattern. Sometimes it is the emptiness that appears when I stop using someone else's unpredictability to stay emotionally occupied. Sometimes it is the space in which my real life, neglected for too long, has to begin speaking again. That kind of loneliness should not always be medicated with contact. Sometimes it should be listened to. Because hidden inside it is information. About what I have postponed. About what I have needed. About what parts of me have been underfed while I focused on the hunger between us. Withdrawal let me hear those quieter hungers. Rest. Beauty. Solitude that did not feel like punishment. Mornings that belonged to me. Evenings that did not require emotional preparedness. A body that could move through the day without waiting for impact. I began to understand that leaving the cycle was not abandonment. It was restoration. Not dramatic, triumphant restoration. Nothing that would look especially cinematic from the outside. More like a woman standing at her sink, rinsing fruit, feeling something in her chest go soft because for the first time in a long time, the evening did not belong to uncertainty. More like a woman sitting by the window with a book she can finally focus on. More like a woman realizing she can walk through her own home without carrying someone else's emotional shadow from room to room. That is what withdrawal gave me. Not revenge. Not superiority. Not an upper hand. It gave me back the possibility of inhabiting my own life. And there is almost nothing more radical than that for a woman who has been trained to remain emotionally available long after availability has stopped being holy. If Daniel noticed the change, that was secondary. If he felt my absence, that was his experience to have. What mattered was that I no longer experienced my withdrawal as loss alone. I began to experience it as truth. As the outer form of an inner decision that had been waiting to be made for a long time. I will not continue to live so far from myself. That sentence became a threshold. And once I crossed it, I understood something I had not understood before. Withdrawal is not a game when it is born from self-respect. It is the long walk back to the woman I left behind while trying to love someone who could not meet me in the place where love becomes peace. The real wound is often older than the man. The pain Daniel touched did not begin with Daniel. That was one of the hardest truths for me to face, not because it excused him, and not because it made the present hurt less real, but because it stripped the story of its simplicity. It would have been easier if he were the whole wound. Easier if I could point to one relationship, one man, one sequence of disappointments, and say, there. That is where the damage lives. But pain is rarely that clean. It arrives in layers. It gathers history. It reaches for older rooms inside me long before I understand why the ache feels so large. For a while, I kept asking myself why this one connection had unsettled me so deeply. Daniel had not been my whole life. He had not built my world and then destroyed it. And yet the grief often felt disproportionate, as if his inconsistency had struck a fault line that had been running beneath me for years. That is exactly what happened. He did not create the deepest wound. He found it. Not deliberately, perhaps. Not with some grand cruelty. But he moved through the exact places where old longing still lived. The places in me that had learned how to survive uncertainty by becoming more patient, more understanding, more emotionally intelligent than the moment required. The places that knew how to normalize distance if distance arrived dressed as complexity. The places that could translate absence into hope for far too long because they had done it before. That is the danger of older wounds. They do not always announce themselves as memory. They arrive as intensity. I do not simply feel disappointed. I feel undone. I do not simply feel hurt. I feel abandoned in a place I recognize but cannot immediately name. I do not simply miss him. I miss something far older that I once believed, once needed, once built entire versions of myself around. That was the deeper truth waiting beneath all my attempts to understand Daniel. I was not only grieving him. I was grieving the old architecture of my own longing. When I began to look honestly, I saw that this ache had roots. It reached back to years before Charleston, before this version of my life, before I had the language I have now. It reached into earlier experiences of learning that love could be present and still feel emotionally unavailable. That care could be implied without being embodied. That I might be valued in practical ways while remaining unseen in the places that needed tenderness most. Some women are wounded by obvious rejection. Others are wounded by subtler things. By love that is partial. By attention that is intermittent. By being appreciated but not deeply known. By growing up in emotional climates where nothing was violent enough to call trauma, yet very little was steady enough to call safety. Those are the kinds of wounds that become difficult to identify because they do not leave one dramatic scar. They leave a pattern. A way of attaching. A way of waiting. A way of overfunctioning in the presence of emotional uncertainty. A way of mistaking the familiar ache for chemistry. That is what I had to confront. The possibility that Daniel did not feel so powerful in my life because he was extraordinary, but because he landed inside a story my nervous system already knew how to tell. The story of hoping a distant person would eventually become reachable. The story of becoming more gracious in the face of confusion. The story of offering depth where there was only partial return. The story of trying to be so emotionally coherent that love would finally become safe. When I say the real wound is often older than the man, I do not mean I am trapped in the past. I mean the past has a way of living inside the present until I become conscious enough to recognize its voice. And its voice is persuasive. It tells me this feeling is about now, only now, entirely now. It tells me the urgency belongs only to this man. It tells me if I can just solve this one relationship, something ancient inside me will finally settle. But that is rarely how it works. Because the deeper wound is not asking to be solved through him. It is asking to be seen through me. That distinction changed everything. Once I understood it, my pain stopped being only about Daniel's inconsistency and started becoming a mirror. Not a flattering mirror. A deeply honest one. It showed me what kinds of emotional conditions I had learned to tolerate. It showed me how quickly I could start bargaining with my own needs when connection felt fragile. It showed me that some part of me still believed love had to be endured before it could be trusted. That belief is costly. It makes a woman noble in all the wrong places. It teaches her to call suffering devotion. It teaches her to call overgiving maturity. It teaches her to feel proud of her capacity to stay calm while something essential inside her is being slowly asked to live on less. I know that pattern because I lived it. Not only with Daniel, but in subtler forms long before him. In places where I accepted emotional half-light because I had grown used to adjusting my eyes. In seasons where being the strong one became such a permanent identity that I no longer noticed how much loneliness it concealed. In dynamics where I kept being the one who understood, the one who held context, the one who made room, the one who translated the silence, the one who stayed emotionally awake for two people. And because I had learned to survive that role, I could do it beautifully. That is what made it dangerous. It did not look like dysfunction from the outside. It looked like composure, grace, patience, emotional sophistication. But beneath those beautiful names, there was often a woman carrying too much and asking for too little. That woman was me. The real sorrow was not only that Daniel hurt me. It was that his presence revealed how long I had been participating in a much older arrangement. One in which I quietly believed that if I loved well enough, understood deeply enough, stayed soft enough, and endured with enough dignity, someone would eventually meet me where I lived. That belief can shape a whole life. It can shape marriages, affairs, divorces, second chances. It can shape the way a woman enters middle age carrying old hunger beneath polished confidence. She may look independent. She may be financially secure. She may have built a life with intelligence and taste and discipline. And still, in the most intimate corner of her heart, she may be waiting for the kind of love that does not require her to overfunction in order to survive it. That is why the pain can feel so disproportionate. It is not just about losing the man. It is about losing the hope attached to him. The fantasy that this time the old pattern would end differently. That this time I would not be the one left interpreting. That this time I would not have to prove my reality. That this time someone would arrive with the emotional maturity to meet me before I had to diminish myself in order to stay connected. When that fantasy breaks, the grief is enormous because it is not only romantic grief. It is historical grief. Grief for all the versions of me that waited. Grief for all the tenderness I offered where reverence never fully formed. Grief for the years I thought my ability to endure emotional scarcity was a sign of wisdom. Grief for the women so many of us become in order to survive being underloved without being able to name it. That grief deserves seriousness. Not performance. Not self-pity. Seriousness. Because once I can name the older wound, I stop asking the current man to carry the whole symbolic weight of my healing. I stop expecting Daniel to answer questions he did not ask but still managed to awaken. I stop making him the gatekeeper of a repair that belongs to a much larger and older story. That does not mean what he did no longer matters. It means it matters in context. It means I can say, with more truth than before, that his inconsistency was painful because it touched a place in me that had long been vulnerable to being left in emotional ambiguity. It means I can stop personalizing every wound as proof that I was not enough. It means I can begin to ask a different question. Not only, why does this hurt so much? But, what has this been reminding me of all along? That question softened something in me. Not by making the pain smaller, but by making me more compassionate toward myself inside it. I stopped calling myself foolish for caring so deeply. I stopped mocking my own tenderness. I stopped acting as if my attachment was a moral failure rather than a clue. Because that is what it was. A clue. A map. Not to Daniel. To me. To the unfinished places. To the older loyalties. To the inherited stories about what women must tolerate in order to be loved. Maybe that story did not begin with me. Maybe it lived in the women before me too. Women who learned to remain gracious in neglect. Women who made meals, raised children, held households, kept appearances, and quietly mistook emotional deprivation for duty. Women who survived by becoming endlessly accommodating and then called that virtue because no one offered them another language. I do not say this to romanticize suffering. I say it because some wounds are not only personal. They are patterned, cultural, generational. And if I do not see that clearly, I may spend the rest of my life trying to heal old female sorrow through the approval of emotionally limited men. There is no freedom in that. Freedom begins when I stop asking the present relationship to solve an ancient ache. When I stop calling reactivation destiny. When I stop confusing familiarity with truth. Daniel may have triggered the wound. But the healing asks something else of me. It asks me to become conscious enough to end the pattern without turning cold. To become discerning without becoming cynical. To let my pain be intelligent enough to show me where my life has been organized around old hunger. That is sacred work. And it is not easy work. Because it asks me to grieve more than one man. It asks me to grieve the woman I was while loving him. The younger versions of me who accepted less because they did not yet know what peace felt like. The self I kept asking to endure in order to preserve connection. But inside that grief, there is also dignity. Because the moment I recognize the wound is older than the man, I stop shrinking my story down to his behavior alone. I begin to see the larger field, the larger healing, the larger return. And in that return, something profound becomes possible. Not just getting over him. Ending the old arrangement inside myself that made a man like him feel familiar in the first place. Turning pain into ritual, rhythm, and private power. There comes a point when understanding is no longer enough. I can understand the pattern. I can understand why Daniel unsettled me. I can understand what the wound touched, what it repeated, what it exposed. I can understand the psychology of longing, the chemistry of attachment, the old story beneath the present ache. And still, none of that automatically changes the shape of an evening when the house is quiet and grief walks in without knocking. This is where healing stops being an idea and becomes a practice. Not a performance. Not a reinvention. Not a public transformation designed to prove that I am thriving. Something quieter than that. Something almost invisible from the outside. A private reordering of my life so that pain is no longer the loudest thing in every room. That was the turn I had to make in Charleston. After a certain point, I realized that heartbreak had become too atmospheric. It was no longer only in my thoughts. It was in the timing of my days, in the texture of my evenings, in the way I moved through my own kitchen, in the charged pause before I looked at my phone, in the half-second of emptiness after setting down groceries or turning off the lamp. Pain had become diffuse. It had seeped into everything because I had not yet given it form. And pain without form can become a private climate. It can make every day feel vaguely haunted. That is why I began to understand the necessity of ritual. Not because ritual is magical. Because it is merciful. Ritual gives shape to what would otherwise spread everywhere. It offers a rhythm to the nervous system when emotion would rather keep me suspended in shapeless longing. It teaches the body that not every hour belongs to loss. It restores sequence. Morning, afternoon, evening. Tea, bath, walk, sleep. Cut herbs, light candle, open window, close the day. These things can sound almost embarrassingly small when spoken out loud, but heartbreak has taught me that small things are often the only things strong enough to carry what is true. I began with mornings because mornings are vulnerable. Before coffee, before daylight fully settles into the room, before I have chosen who I am going to be that day, there is a threshold. For a long time, Daniel had been waiting there. Not physically, but psychically. His absence had become one of the first things I felt. The habit of checking, remembering, anticipating had entered the day before I did. So I changed the order. I stopped reaching for my phone first. I opened the curtains. I made coffee slowly. I stood barefoot at the counter while the kettle heated and let the ordinary world return to me in pieces, the pale Charleston light across the wood floor, the faint movement of leaves outside, the sound of water before it boiled, the smell of ground coffee before thought became narrative. I did not do this to be virtuous. I did it because grief had made me abrupt, and I needed to remember that my own life still had texture. That was the beginning. Then I started writing things down. Not dramatic pages. Not polished reflections meant to sound wise. Just notes. Honest, stripped-down observations. Slept badly. Felt heavier after sunset. Wanted to hear from him around 4 p.m. Felt calmer after walking. Shoulders softened while cooking. That kind of writing became a map. It showed me that pain was not a permanent state. It moved. It had rhythms. It intensified under certain conditions and eased under others. It was influenced by loneliness, by fatigue, by hunger, by memory, by beauty, by whether I had spent the whole afternoon indoors with my own thoughts. That knowledge was power of a different kind. Not loud power. Not triumphant power. Private power. The kind that grows when I stop seeing myself as someone being dragged by emotion and begin seeing myself as someone capable of noticing what feeds it, what softens it, what deepens it, what distorts it. I was no longer only the woman who had been hurt. I was becoming the woman who could study the conditions of her own aliveness. And that changed everything. I began making Sunday mornings sacred in a simple way. I baked. Not because baking solves heartbreak, and not because I was trying to become one of those women who heals by becoming picturesque. I baked because waiting for something to rise in the oven taught my body a different relationship to time. The house would fill with the smell of lemon or cinnamon or warm butter, and for an hour I was not waiting for a message, not replaying a conversation, not bargaining with absence. I was inside a process that asked nothing from me except attention. Attention is medicine when pain has made me fragmented. So are beauty and repetition. I bought flowers sometimes, even when it felt unnecessary. I put them in water as if my own table deserved witnessing. I folded the same blanket over the same chair near the window. I lit a candle after dinner, not for romance, not for ceremony in some grand sense, but because it signaled to my body that the evening could belong to me. That it did not have to remain an open emotional corridor where memory and longing wandered freely. I made one rule that became unexpectedly sacred: no emotional negotiations at night. The night magnifies everything. Loneliness deepens. Memory becomes selective. The mind gets theatrical in the dark. I had learned that almost nothing good comes from trying to solve the heart when I am tired. So I stopped. After a certain hour, I did not revisit messages. I did not imagine what I might say. I did not indulge the old ritual of mental return. I made tea. I showered. I read poetry or a few pages of something beautifully written. I let language become shelter instead of argument. Some evenings I walked. Not for exercise exactly. For proportion. Along the water, through familiar Charleston streets, past houses with their warm windows and iron gates and the kind of stillness that reminds me not every life is unfolding inside emotional emergency. Walking returned me to scale. My story was no longer the only thing happening in the world. There was dusk. Salt in the air. A dog pulling lightly on its leash. Porch lights coming on. Someone laughing from inside a courtyard. The world kept moving without consulting my heartbreak, and there was something strangely comforting in that. Ritual did not remove pain. It altered my relationship to it. Instead of becoming swallowed by feeling, I began to hold it inside a structure. A walk could contain the ache of late afternoon. Cooking could hold the restlessness of early evening. Writing could catch the thoughts that otherwise would have circled for hours. Stretching on the living room rug in the morning could return me to a body that had become too identified with contraction. I also changed the physical shape of my home. That mattered more than I expected. There was a chair where I had spent too many evenings waiting, checking, wondering. I moved it. I changed the lamp beside it. I stacked books there instead of leaving the surface empty. I put a small bowl on the table, some flowers, a folded throw. It sounds minor. It was not. The body remembers where it has waited. It remembers where it has diminished itself in hope. Sometimes healing requires changing the architecture of longing so that the room no longer collaborates with the wound. I began tending herbs on the back steps. Basil, mint, rosemary. Nothing ambitious. Just green things that required steady care and responded to it. There was humility in that. A certain relief in caring for something that did not confuse me. I watered them in the morning, touched the leaves, smelled them on my fingers, and felt some part of me return to the simplest truth. Life answers differently when it is tended with consistency. That truth reached farther than the herbs. It began to change the way I understood love, attention, and self-respect. I stopped looking for intensity and started noticing rhythm. What steadies me? What drains me? What brings me back into my own skin? What leaves me vaguely absent from myself? Pain had once been the thing that proved how deeply I felt. Now I was more interested in what made me feel whole. That is the quiet alchemy of ritual. It turns pain from a spectacle into a practice of return. It takes what is formless and gives it rhythm. It takes what is private and gives it dignity. It takes all the energy that used to circle around Daniel and begins placing it, one gentle act at a time, back into the life that is actually mine. This kind of power does not announce itself. It does not post updates. It does not need witnesses. It does not even look impressive, most of the time. It looks like a woman washing fruit in the sink. A woman opening the windows. A woman going to bed on time. A woman buying flowers for her own table. A woman noticing that she has gone 3 hours without checking her phone and, instead of calling that progress, simply calling it peace. That was the deeper shift. I was no longer waiting for pain to end before I allowed myself a life. I was building a life sturdy enough to hold pain without being defined by it. And in that life, something very quiet began to grow. Not revenge. Not detachment. Not superiority. A different intimacy with myself. A rhythm I could trust. A private power that did not depend on being seen. That kind of power changed the atmosphere first. The rest followed after. Let him feel the absence, not as punishment, but as truth. By the time Daniel began to feel my absence, I had already been living inside it for a long time. That is what people rarely understand about a woman who finally steps back. They think the silence begins when she stops replying. They think the distance begins when she no longer reaches. They think the absence is created in one visible moment, one withheld message, one unanswered call, one evening where she decides not to reopen the old door. But for me, the absence began much earlier than that. It began the first time I sat in a room with him and felt myself become less present than I had been before he arrived. It began the first time I noticed that my warmth was carrying more of the connection than his consistency ever did. It began when I realized that I could be physically near him and still feel a strange emotional vacancy, as if I were somehow both there and not there, participating in something that asked for my tenderness without ever fully making room for my truth. That is the deeper sorrow in these kinds of relationships. A woman is often absent from herself long before she becomes absent from the man. So when I finally pulled back, it was not sudden, not strategic, not designed to make Daniel suffer. It was the visible form of something that had already been happening inside me for months. I had already been learning the ache of not reaching. I had already been teaching my body how to survive the silence without filling it. I had already been sitting through the urge to explain, to soften, to leave the door cracked open just enough for his return to remain possible. By the time he noticed my distance, it was no longer new to me. I had already paid for it privately. That matters. Because people often misunderstand absence as manipulation when they have never had to live through the interior labor that honest absence requires. Manipulation wants a result. It wants control. It withholds in order to produce movement in someone else. It says, in one way or another, feel this and come toward me. But the kind of absence I am talking about is born from a different truth entirely. It says, I cannot continue offering my presence where I disappear. That is not a game. That is alignment. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing your presence has been treated like atmosphere. Always there. Warm. Reliable. Soft enough to absorb discomfort. Available enough to ease tension. Gentle enough to make someone else feel less alone without ever asking whether the arrangement is costing you your peace. For a long time, that was the role I occupied with Daniel. Not because he declared it. These things are rarely that explicit. But I could feel it in the shape of our connection. I was the one who kept emotional continuity alive. I was the one who brought reflection, depth, steadiness, language. I was the one who kept making the space between us livable. And the tragedy of being that woman is this: what I am giving can become invisible precisely because I give it so consistently. Not unimportant. Invisible. This is how entitlement often forms in intimate relationships. Not always through cruelty. Sometimes through repetition. Through the quiet assumption that because something has always been offered, it will continue to be. Access becomes normal. Warmth becomes expected. Emotional labor becomes part of the environment. The other person stops feeling the cost of what I provide because he no longer has to imagine life without it. Absence restores contrast. And contrast reveals. That is why a man may not fully feel the shape of a woman's presence until it is withdrawn. Not because he never benefited from it, but because familiarity can make even sacred things disappear into the background. I resisted that truth for a long time because I did not want my absence to become a lesson. I did not want to participate in that kind of dynamic at all. I wanted to be understood while present. I wanted to be valued before I had to remove myself. I wanted the dignity of being recognized without having to become scarce. But life does not always grant that kind of justice. Sometimes the only thing that makes truth visible is space. When I stopped moving toward Daniel in the old ways, something changed immediately, though not always outwardly. The rhythm broke. The expected pattern failed to arrive. The emotional bridge I used to build across every silence was no longer there. And what struck me most was not his reaction at first, but the strange cleanness of the space that appeared. Painful, yes. But cleaner than confusion. No more constant rearranging of my dignity around his uncertainty. No more private negotiations with myself about whether I was being too rigid, too sensitive, too hopeful, too forgiving. The space was painful, but it was honest. That honesty gave the absence its power. Not power over him. Power over distortion. Because when I remained present in the old way, the connection could continue pretending to be more mutual than it was. My consistency disguised his inconsistency. My effort softened the reality of his distance. My warmth made the whole thing look more alive than it actually was. Sometimes a woman's presence can keep a false story running simply because she is carrying enough emotional substance for two people. Absence ends that illusion. Not by argument. By exposure. Once I stepped back, Daniel had to meet the space where my effort used to be. Whether he understood it fully or not, he was left with the altered atmosphere. The missing reply. The missing reassurance. The missing softness he had quietly learned to rely on. He had to feel the connection without the invisible labor that had once stabilized it. This is why absence is often called cruel by people who benefited from constant access. Not because it is truly cruel. Because it reveals dependency they never had to name while you were still giving. That realization was sobering for me too. I had to face the possibility that part of what Daniel missed was not me in my full humanity, but the quality of emotional shelter I had provided. My responsiveness. My depth. My steadiness. My willingness to keep showing up in the half-light. This is one of the most painful truths a woman can encounter, Sometimes a man feels the loss of her energy before he fully understands the loss of her heart. That does not mean he feels nothing real. It means I must learn discernment. Because one of the great dangers of absence is this: when he finally reaches, I may be tempted to mistake renewed attention for transformation. The message arrives. The softness returns. The urgency appears. Suddenly he is asking, noticing, wondering, reaching with more force than before. And if I am still organized around longing, I can interpret that movement as proof. Proof that he cares. Proof that the bond mattered. Proof that the silence worked. Proof that the story is not over. But attention is not the same as change. And being missed is not the same as being met. That distinction protected me. It kept me from turning every late realization into redemption. Because the truth is, some men reach back when absence disrupts their access, not because they have become more emotionally honest, but because they are uncomfortable with the loss of what was once available to them. They miss the regulation, the familiarity, the sense that someone warm and emotionally literate still exists just beyond their inconsistency. They miss the version of the relationship that allowed them closeness without the full burden of accountability. That is why absence must never be used as bait. If I withdraw only to provoke pursuit, I remain trapped in the same system. I am still measuring my worth by his movement. Still making his response the proof that I matter. Still turning my self-protection into a disguised plea. But when absence comes from truth, his response becomes information rather than salvation. That is a profound shift. It means I can watch without collapsing. I can notice without overinterpreting. I can hear from Daniel without instantly returning to the woman I used to be. Because the question is no longer, does he feel my absence? The deeper question is, what does his response reveal, and what does my body know when I receive it? That last part matters most. My body has become the witness I trust now. Not the fantasy. Not the memory of his tenderness. Not the ache that wants one more chance to turn into meaning. My body. Does it soften at the thought of re-entering this dynamic? Does it feel spacious, safe, unguarded? Or does it tighten? Does something in me brace, even in the presence of kind words? That information is sacred. It tells me whether I am standing near possibility or merely near a familiar wound dressed in gentler language. Absence taught me to trust that kind of knowledge. It taught me that a woman does not have to keep offering her presence in order to prove the sincerity of her love. It taught me that removing myself from what harms me is not abandonment, it is truth taking visible form. It taught me that clarity may arrive not in the conversation itself, but in what becomes obvious once my labor is no longer there to disguise the imbalance. And perhaps most importantly, it taught me that absence is not an act of revenge when it is rooted in self-respect. It is a declaration without noise. A way of saying, I will not continue to make myself available to a reality that diminishes me. That sentence does not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. In fact, it is often strongest when it is lived rather than explained. I think that is what changes the atmosphere most. Not the silence itself, but the truth inside it. The refusal to keep appearing in the same form after being mishandled. The refusal to keep converting pain into accessibility. The refusal to let love become proof of endurance at the expense of peace. If Daniel felt that shift, then he was finally standing inside a truth I had been carrying alone for too long. And if he was confused by it, that confusion no longer belonged to me. My work was not to make my absence easy for him to understand. My work was to stop abandoning myself just because I was afraid the truth would make me harder to reach. In the end, that is what absence became for me. Not punishment. Not strategy. Not a performance of power. Just truth, finally given enough space to be seen. The real confusion, I no longer need him to choose me. The deepest shift was never that Daniel might finally understand me. It was never that he might miss me more clearly, regret me more honestly, or return with the kind of language I once thought could redeem the whole story. For a long time, I believed that would be the ending that mattered. Not because I wanted revenge. Not even because I wanted him back in the simplest sense. What I wanted was more subtle and far more dangerous. I wanted his choice to heal something in me. I wanted his clarity to settle the old unrest. I wanted his recognition to confirm that all this feeling, all this patience, all this carrying, all this inward labor had not been foolish, had not been one-sided, had not been love misplaced beyond repair. I wanted the ending to tell me something flattering about my own worth. That if he finally chose me cleanly, then perhaps I had not imagined my value. Perhaps I had not been too much, too deep, too earnest, too late, too wounded, too hard to hold. That is the arrangement I had to see clearly before I could finally step out of it. Because beneath so much heartbreak there is often a private bargain I do not fully admit to myself. I tell myself I want honesty, closure, peace. But underneath those noble words, another desire is trembling. I want the man who hurt me to become the witness who restores me. I want him to be the one who says, without saying, "You were worth choosing all along." That is why this kind of pain can last so long. It is not only grief over what happened. It is grief bound up with identity. It is the agony of handing another person too much symbolic power over the most sacred parts of my self-concept. My lovability. My desirability. My value. My emotional legitimacy. My right to be met fully. Once those things become entangled with whether Daniel returns, regrets, chooses, explains, or stays, I am no longer just loving a man. I am negotiating with my own worth through him. That is the real confusion. Not that he does not understand me. That I once believed I needed his choice to understand myself. There is no humiliation quite like seeing that clearly. Not because it means I was weak. Because it means I was human in one of the oldest ways possible. I wanted love to redeem more than the present. I wanted it to answer older questions with one beautiful conclusion. I wanted one man's certainty to soothe all the places where life had once left me half-seen. That is not foolishness. It is longing with a history. But if I do not become conscious of it, longing will keep dressing itself up as destiny. And then I will call every emotionally complicated man meaningful simply because he has activated the right ache. That is the trap. Not loving too deeply. Confusing activation with truth. I had to sit with the possibility that much of my suffering around Daniel was not only about losing him. It was about losing the fantasy that he would eventually resolve something ancient in me. That through him, I would no longer feel like the woman waiting in the half-light. That through him, I would be chosen in a way that made all the earlier ambiguity look like preparation instead of pattern. That through him, the old ache would be rewritten into a story with dignity at the center. But not every longing is prophetic. Some longing is just old hunger finding a familiar shape. And the moment I understood that, everything began to reorder itself. I stopped asking, even privately, whether Daniel would finally see what he had in me. I started asking whether I had truly seen what this dynamic was costing me. I stopped asking whether he would come back different. I started asking why I had been willing to remain in a bond that required so much translation just to keep it emotionally coherent. I stopped asking whether he loved me in his own complicated way. I started asking whether I felt peaceful in the presence of that love. Those are different questions. Adult questions. Questions that do not flatter fantasy. Questions that bring me out of emotional mythology and back into lived reality. And lived reality, however painful, is where freedom begins. Because once I no longer need him to choose me, Something inside me grows quiet in the best possible way. Not empty. Not numb. Quiet as in no longer bargaining. Quiet as in no longer building elaborate inner arguments for why a little more patience might turn confusion into intimacy. Quiet as in no longer treating every small movement from him as a clue to my own worth. That kind of quiet is almost holy after heartbreak. It feels like a room inside me finally being vacated by noise. I began to notice what changed once I stopped making Daniel the final authority on what my value meant. The city around me changed first, or maybe I was the one who changed enough to see it. Charleston no longer felt like a backdrop for waiting. My walks stopped being places to rehearse possible conversations. My kitchen stopped feeling like a witness to emotional suspension. My evenings stopped belonging to possibility and started belonging to me. Such small sentences, and yet they mark the difference between a life lived in orbit and a life reclaimed at its center. That is the quieter miracle of healing. Not that I stop caring. That I stop organizing my existence around being chosen. Because there is a very particular sorrow women carry when they have loved well and not been met in equal depth. It can create a temptation to turn the whole experience into a referendum on the self. If he could not choose me fully, what does that say about me? If he could stay vague where I was clear, what does that say about my value? If he could receive so much of my tenderness and still fail to rise, what does that say about what I was offering? The answer, I know now, is far less dramatic than pain wants it to be. It says more about his limits than my lovability. It says more about his capacity than my worth. It says more about what he could not sustain than about what I deserved. But these truths only become real once I stop demanding that he be the one to deliver them. That is the real ending of the old arrangement. I no longer need his remorse to validate my wound. I no longer need his return to confirm my significance. I no longer need his attention to make my life vivid. I no longer need his choosing to make me believe I am choosable. This does not mean I become above longing. It does not mean I turn to stone. I can still miss him in passing. I can still grieve what was beautiful, even if it was not ultimately safe. I can still feel tenderness when I remember the parts that were real. Healing has nothing to do with pretending the heart is cleaner than it is. But the center of gravity has changed. That is what matters. I am no longer standing in the old place with my hands open, hoping his movement will settle the unrest inside me. I am standing somewhere else now. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere more honest. Somewhere that no longer asks a man to complete a sentence my own life has been trying to write from the beginning. I think this is what truly confuses a man like Daniel, if he notices anything at all. Not that I withdrew. Not that I stopped explaining. Not even that I stopped making myself available in the familiar ways. What confuses him is that the old mechanism no longer works. The old wound is no longer steering. The old hunger is no longer negotiating. I am not waiting in the same place to be named, chosen, reassured, completed. I have stepped outside that arrangement. And from the outside, that can look mysterious. From the inside, it feels like relief. Relief is not a dramatic emotion. It does not announce itself the way heartbreak does. It arrives quietly. In the fact that I can hear his name without losing my balance. In the fact that I no longer search every gesture for hidden meaning. In the fact that I can sit alone at dusk and feel the day close around me without imagining that some missing text is what stands between me and being fully alive. In the fact that my peace has stopped feeling like a consolation prize and started feeling like truth. That is the deeper power here. Not making him chase. Not making him wonder. Not making him hurt. Simply no longer needing his choice to become my definition. This changes future love too. Because when I no longer confuse being chosen with being cherished, my standards become quieter and cleaner. I stop romanticizing intensity. I stop mistaking unpredictability for depth. I stop asking chemistry to perform the work of safety. I stop accepting emotional ambiguity as the price of feeling deeply. I become less interested in being desired and more interested in being met. Met with steadiness. Met with honesty. Met with the kind of presence that does not require me to sacrifice my nervous system in order to stay. That is not bitterness. It is refinement. A woman who has walked through this kind of heartbreak and returned to herself does not become harder in the way people fear. She becomes truer, less willing to worship longing, less available for fragmentation, less susceptible to the old seduction of almost love. She does not need grand declarations anymore because she has learned to recognize something more valuable than intensity. She has learned to recognize peace. And peace, once I have known it in my own body, becomes impossible to trade away cheaply. So in the end, the story was never really about how to make Daniel understand my value. It was about whether I would continue abandoning myself while waiting for him to confirm it. That is the final threshold. The final honesty. The deepest return. I do not need him to choose me in order to believe that I am worthy of being chosen. I only need to stop handing that decision away. In the end, this was never only a story about Daniel. It was a story about a woman who looked fine from the outside and was quietly unraveling on the inside. A woman who did not fall apart in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones. In the checking of her phone. In the rehearsing of conversations that never brought peace. In the way one man's inconsistency could enter an ordinary afternoon and dim the entire emotional light of the day. It was a story about how pain first made her want to be understood, then made her want to react, then forced her to confront something even deeper, that the wound he touched did not begin with him, and the healing would not end with him either. She began where many women begin, trying to explain herself beautifully enough to be seen, trying to stay measured enough to be respected, trying to remain soft without disappearing. But over time, she discovered that constant explanation was draining her spirit, that reaction was giving away her center, and that her body had been telling the truth long before her mind was ready to admit it. She learned that stillness is not weakness, that silence can be dignity, that boundaries do not need a performance, and that withdrawal is not always rejection, sometimes it is the most sacred return a woman can make to herself. As she stepped back, she started to see that her pain was layered. Daniel had hurt her, yes. But he had also awakened older grief, the old ache of not being fully met, the old pattern of overgiving, the old female training that teaches women to endure confusion with grace and call it love. And once she saw that, the entire story changed. She was no longer just trying to understand a man. She was trying to understand the woman she had become while loving him. That is where the real transformation happened. Not in getting an apology. Not in being chosen. Not in making him miss her. But in realizing that she had spent too much of her life asking love to confirm her worth, when her worth had never belonged in another person's hands to begin with. She rebuilt herself not through grand reinvention, but through private rituals, honest stillness, and the slow reclaiming of attention. She stopped turning her pain into accessibility. She stopped mistaking attention for devotion. She stopped waiting for his clarity to become the permission slip for her own. And that is the deeper lesson for anyone listening now. When someone hurts you, the most important question is not whether they will finally understand your value. The real question is whether you will keep abandoning yourself while waiting for them to do it. Your life can change the moment you stop chasing explanation and start listening to what your body, your exhaustion, your sadness, and your peace have been trying to say all along. The way to apply this now is not through grand speeches or dramatic exits. It begins in smaller, truer ways. Notice what happens in your body around people who say they care. Notice whether you feel peaceful or vigilant. Stop over-explaining boundaries that your soul is already tired of negotiating. Let your changed energy tell the truth. Create rituals that return you to yourself. Protect your evenings. Protect your attention. Protect the quiet places in you that have spent too long being offered to people who only knew how to visit, not stay. Most of all, remember this: healing is not becoming cold. It is becoming clear. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Here's a small question for you. When someone hurts me, what is the deeper path? A. Keep explaining until they finally understand me. B. Return to myself and let my peace reveal the truth. Comment A or B below. And what do you think? Have you ever experienced a time when silence, distance, or choosing yourself taught you more than one more conversation ever could? Share your perspective in the comments so others can read and reflect too. And subscribe to the channel to support this space and help keep these kinds of honest, meaningful stories coming.